rain hit the windows like stones. Margaret Hartwell heard it before she saw it. She was sitting near the fire in the front room of Hartwell House, her reading glasses balanced on the end of her nose and a book open in her lap, when the sound of the storm changed. It had been raining all evening, a steady, cold autumn rain that swept across the fields and made the trees bend. But then came something else. A crack, then a crash, then silence. She set the book down. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Poole, appeared in the doorway before Margaret had even stood up. The older woman's face was tight, with the particular expression she wore whenever something unusual was about to become Margaret's problem. "There's been an accident on the road, ma'am," Mrs. Poole said. "A carriage, down in the ditch near the gate." Margaret was already reaching for her wool shawl. She had grown up on this land. She had walked every inch of the lane that connected Hartwell House to the main road, and she knew exactly which part of it turned treacherous in heavy rain. The ditch on the east side was deep and wide. A carriage wheel caught in that ditch at speed would do exactly what she imagined it had done. She did not stop to change her shoes. She pulled the front door open and walked out into the rain. The lane was dark. The lantern above the gate swung wildly in the wind, throwing moving light across the wet gravel. Margaret wrapped the shawl tighter and walked quickly, her boots splashing through puddles that had not been there an hour ago. She heard the horse first, a deep, frightened sound. Then she saw it. A large black carriage tilted hard to the left, one rear wheel broken clean off and lying in the mud several feet away. The horse attached to it was standing still but trembling, held by a young man in a servant's coat who was speaking quietly to the animal and trying very hard not to look as frightened as he clearly was. And standing beside the ruined carriage, one hand resting on its side, was a tall man in a dark traveling coat. He was not looking at the carriage. He was looking at her. Margaret stopped a few feet away and studied the situation quickly. The carriage was not going anywhere. The wheel was beyond repair tonight. The road in both directions was empty and dark, and the nearest town was 4 miles south. The rain was getting worse. She looked at the man. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that the rain had plastered flat against his forehead, and a face that gave very little away. He was not panicked. He was not shouting at the servant, or cursing the road, or doing any of the things that men who found themselves in ruined vehicles on dark nights often did. He was simply standing there, with one hand on the carriage, and watching her with calm, steady eyes that she could not quite read. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "Are you the owner of this property?" "I am," she said. "Margaret Hartwell. The house is just there." She gestured up the lane. "You cannot stay on this road. Come inside." He hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. She noticed it. Then he straightened, nodded once, and turned to say something quietly to the servant. The young man began leading the horse toward the gate. The man in the dark coat fell into step beside Margaret and walked with her through the rain without speaking. She did not ask his name until they were inside. Mrs. Poole had already instructed the kitchen girl to stoke the fire in the front room and had appeared with dry towels before either of them had fully crossed the threshold. The servant, whose name was Owen, was taken around to the kitchen entrance, where he was given hot food and a place near the stove. The horse was stabled. The broken carriage was left where it was until morning. The man with the dark coat stood in Margaret's front room and accepted a towel from Mrs. Poole with a polite nod. "Thank you," he said to the housekeeper. Then he looked at Margaret. "I am sorry for the trouble." "It's no trouble," she said. It was the truth. Hartwell House had not had a guest in almost 2 years, and there was something about the quiet authority in this man's voice that made the house feel, just briefly, less empty. "Will you sit? I'll have supper brought." "You're very kind." He sat in the chair nearest the fire. He looked tired, not the frantic tired of someone who had been fighting the road, but the deep, settled tired of someone who had been moving for a very long time and had simply run out of movement. "My name is Ashford," he said. "Mr. James Ashford." Margaret sat across from him. "Are you traveling far, Mr. Ashford?" "North," he said. "I was due to stop for the night in Carlton, but the road took longer than expected." "The road always takes longer than expected in October," she said, and he gave a short, brief sound that was almost a laugh. Supper was simple. Mrs. Poole brought out cold meat, bread, a dish of preserved vegetables from the cellar, and a pot of tea. Margaret had not eaten since early afternoon and was hungry. She noticed that Mr. Ashford ate steadily and without complaint. Some men she had known, men of a certain background, grew difficult when presented with food that did not meet their standard. They pushed things around the plate or made small, pointed remarks. Mr. Ashford ate everything that was put in front of him, with the quiet appreciation of a man who understood that a warm meal on a cold night was a genuine gift. She found herself watching him in the way she had once watched the river near her father's house, not because it was dramatic, but because it was interesting. There was something about his stillness that caught her attention. He listened when she spoke. He asked questions that showed he had been paying attention. When she mentioned that her husband had died 2 winters ago, he did not fill the silence with the usual polite expressions that people offered. He simply said, "I'm sorry," and meant it, and let the silence sit between them for a moment, before moving on. They talked until well past 9. It was Mrs. Poole who finally appeared in the doorway and gave Margaret the look that meant a room had been prepared. "I'll have Owen sent up to the room above the kitchen," Mrs. Poole said. She looked at Mr. Ashford. "And the blue room is made up for you, sir. It has its own fireplace." He stood immediately. He was taller than Margaret had realized when he was sitting. He thanked Mrs. Poole with the same measured politeness he had shown all evening, and then turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "I am in your debt." "You are in my guest room," she said. "There is no debt involved. Good night, Mr. Ashford." He looked at her for a moment, with those calm, unreadable eyes. Then he nodded once. "Good night," he said. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs as she sat back down by the fire. The clock on the mantel read 9:15. Outside, the rain continued without any sign of letting up. She picked up her book and found she could not read it. She sat instead and looked at the fire and thought about the strange, quiet man upstairs who had walked through her gate and into her evening, as though he had always been heading precisely here. She did not know, then, what the days ahead would bring. She only knew that the house felt different, warmer, somehow, and fuller, in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. When morning came, the rain had not stopped. Margaret was awake before the house stirred, as she always was. She dressed simply, went down to the kitchen to speak with the cook about breakfast, and was standing at the back window looking out at the gray, wet fields when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Mr. Ashford appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later. He had changed his coat. He looked rested. He glanced at the window and the thick, unbroken cloud beyond it, and said nothing for a moment. "The wheel is gone," he said finally. "I know," said Margaret. "I sent Owen to look at it at first light. The axle is cracked as well. It will need a wheelwright, and the nearest one is in Ashton, which is 6 miles east. The road to Ashton, however, is flooded at the crossing." He absorbed this without visible frustration. "How long?" "The rain should ease by tomorrow," she said. "The crossing is usually passable within a day of the rain stopping, so 2 days, perhaps 3. He looked at the window again, then he looked at her. "Mrs. Hartwell, I cannot impose on you for 3 days." "You can," she said simply, "because there is no other option that does not involve you standing in a flooded lane for 3 days, which seems both inconvenient and unnecessary." She paused. "Breakfast is in half an hour. The dining room faces east and gets what light there is. You are welcome to it." He studied her for a moment in a way that she was beginning to recognize. It was not rudeness, it was assessment. He looked at things, at people, as though he was trying to understand them fully before he spoke. "Thank you," he said at last. Breakfast was boiled eggs, toast, a pot of strong tea, and a dish of jam that Mrs. Poole had made in August from the plums in the garden. Margaret sat at the head of the table, and Mr. Ashford sat to her left, and they ate in a silence that was comfortable rather than strained. Through the east window, the fields were lost in low gray mist. The trees along the far edge of the property were barely visible. "Do you manage this estate alone?" Mr. Ashford asked. "I do," said Margaret. "My husband and I managed it together for 11 years. When he passed, I continued. My steward, Mr. Graves, handles the tenants and the farm accounts. I handle the house and the decisions. And you prefer it that way?" She looked at him. "I prefer the work," she said. "Whether I prefer doing it alone is a different question." He did not press further, but he nodded, slowly, as though she had told him something that he recognized. After breakfast, she gave him the small sitting room off the library, which had a writing desk and a window that looked onto the garden. He thanked her and disappeared inside. She heard the scratch of a pen shortly after. She did not disturb him. She had her own work to do. The household accounts needed attention. She had a letter to write to her sister in Bath. The vegetable garden needed covering before the next frost, which the cook insisted was coming within the week. Margaret moved through these tasks with the same steady efficiency she brought to everything. She was not a woman who grew still when there was something to be done. But twice during the morning she found herself pausing near the door of the small sitting room, not to enter, but simply because the sound of someone else moving inside the house, the quiet creak of a chair, the turn of a page, was more pleasant than she had expected. At noon, Mrs. Poole brought lunch to the dining room, and Margaret knocked on the sitting room door to let Mr. Ashford know. He looked up from the desk with the expression of a man surfacing from deep water. There were papers spread in front of him, covered in close, precise handwriting. He gathered them together quickly and rose. "You work even while stranded," Margaret observed. "There is always work," he said. It was not a complaint. It sounded, if anything, like a statement of resignation, as though the work followed him everywhere, and he had long since stopped being surprised by it. They sat down to lunch together, and something shifted. Margaret could not have explained it precisely. It was not one thing, but the accumulation of small things. The way he listened when she spoke about the estate. The way he did not offer opinions unless she asked for them, and then gave them clearly, and without softening them into meaninglessness. The way he looked out the window at the bare fields and asked, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, what would be planted there in spring. She told him about the wheat on the east fields and the barley near the river, about the tenants' cottages that needed new roofs before winter, about the argument she was having with Mr. Graves over whether to rent out the old mill. Mr. Ashford listened to all of it. Then he said, "What do you think the mill is worth if you keep it?" No one had asked her that. People offered her opinions. They told her what her husband would have done, or what she ought to do, or what was wise for a woman in her position. Mr. Ashford simply asked what she thought. "More than it's worth rented out," she said. "But it needs repair first, and repair costs money I'd have to borrow. And you don't like borrowing money." "I like knowing where I stand," she said. "Borrowed money makes the ground unsteady." He looked at her with something in his expression that she could not name. Not admiration exactly. Something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. "I understand that completely," he said. And she believed him. The afternoon passed. The rain continued. Mrs. Poole lit extra candles in the library, and Margaret found Mr. Ashford there at 5 o'clock, standing before her shelves with his hands behind his back, reading the spines. "You have a good library," he said without turning around. "My husband was a reader," she said. "And I am also a reader. Between us, we did a great deal of damage to our book budget." He turned. He was almost smiling. Not quite. His face seemed to consider smiling, and then decide against it fully. But the look was there at the edges. What did he read? History mostly, natural philosophy. He had a particular interest in the land. She moved to the shelf and pulled out a slim brown volume. This was his favorite. A very old book about the management of English estates in the time of the early kings. He read it every winter. Mr. Ashford took it from her. He opened it carefully, the way people opened books they already respected before they had read a single word. He looked at the first page for a long moment. "May I borrow it?" he asked. She hesitated, not because she doubted him, but because the book had sat in the same position on that shelf for 2 years, and she had not touched it, and it felt significant that she was willing to let someone else hold it. "Yes," she said. He looked up. Their eyes met. She looked away first. That evening, they sat in the front room again after supper. A proper fire, the wind outside the windows, tea on the side table. Mr. Ashford had the old book open in his lap but was not reading it. He was looking at the fire. "Do you have family nearby?" he asked. "A sister in Bath," said Margaret. "She has been trying to convince me to close the house and go live with her for 2 years. I have been politely refusing for 2 years. You won't go?" "This is my house," she said, simply, with no drama in it at all. He nodded. He turned a page of the book. "I have a house," he said after a while. Several, in fact. I spend most of my time trying to decide which one needs attention most urgently, and then traveling toward it. That sounds exhausting, she said. It is, he said. She looked at him. When did you last stay somewhere without needing to be there for a reason? He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the fire. I don't remember, he said at last. The clock ticked. The fire crackled. The rain went on. Well, said Margaret, setting down her tea, you have no choice but to stay here for 2 days, with no reason, except the rain. Perhaps that's worth something. He looked at her. And this time, he smiled. Fully. It changed his face entirely, made it warmer, younger, and somehow more honest than his careful stillness. It lasted only a few seconds, and then it was gone. But she had seen it. She thought about it later, lying awake in the dark while the rain drummed on the roof. She thought about his voice, when he spoke about his houses, about the way he had said he could not remember the last time he had simply stayed somewhere, about the book in his hands, and the look on his face when she had given it to him. She thought about how strange it was that this man, a stranger she had pulled out of a ditch in a storm, felt less like a stranger than anyone she had spoken to in months. She told herself it was just the rain, the particular closeness that bad weather brought, the way a storm pressed people together simply by removing every other option. She told herself that, and almost believed it, and then finally fell asleep while the wind moved through the trees, and Mr. Ashford's borrowed book sat on his nightstand 1 floor above her, and the broken carriage sat in the ditch at the gate, and the lane filled slowly, steadily with rain. The second morning arrived the same as the first, gray, wet, and quiet. Margaret woke before dawn, which was nothing new. She had been waking before dawn for most of her adult life. It had begun in the early years of her marriage, when there was simply too much to be done, and not enough hours to do it, and it had continued, after her husband passed, because habit, once formed, does not leave simply because the reason for it has gone. She dressed, went downstairs, put the kettle on herself because cook did not arrive until 6, and stood at the kitchen window watching the dark sky begin to lose its darkness. The rain had eased a little overnight. It was now a fine, persistent drizzle, rather than the hard, punishing rain of the night before. The lane was a river of mud. The fields beyond the garden wall were invisible behind mist. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps on the stairs were quiet, but the house was quiet too, and she had learned the sounds of this house so thoroughly over the years that anything new stood out immediately. She turned as he appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, his dark hair still slightly disordered from sleep. He stopped when he saw her. I didn't expect anyone to be up, he said. I'm always up, she said. The kettle is nearly boiling. Sit down, Mr. Ashford. He sat at the kitchen table, which was not the formal dining room, not the proper place for a guest. She noticed that he did not seem to mind. He looked at the window, at the slow gray light coming in, and said nothing for a moment. Did you sleep? She asked. Better than I have in some time, he said. He sounded faintly surprised by it. She brought 2 cups to the table and poured the tea. She had not had anyone to pour tea for in the kitchen at this hour for 2 years. She did not think about that too closely. I'd like to do something useful today, he said, if that is possible. She looked at him over her cup. Useful how? The carriage is ruined for the moment. The road is impassable. I have work to finish, and I'll finish it. But I am not someone who does well with nothing to do beyond that. He paused. What needs doing on the estate today? She studied him. You are asking to work. I am asking to be of some use, he said. Those are the same thing. She thought about it for a moment. The woodpile at the back of the house needed splitting and stacking before winter. The tenant's fence on the east boundary had been reported as failing by Mr. Graves, but Graves himself was away until Friday. The garden needed the last of the autumn cutting. None of these were tasks for a guest. All of them were tasks she would need to arrange somehow. There is a fence on the east boundary, she said. 2 posts down, and a length of rail missing. The timber is stacked near the barn. He nodded. I'll need tools, and Owen. Owen can show you where things are. He was already standing. She watched him walk through the kitchen door and around the side of the house toward the stables, with a straightness to his back and a sureness to his step that she associated less with idle travelers and more with men who were used to arriving somewhere and immediately beginning. She did not know what to make of it. She poured herself a second cup of tea and thought about it until Cook arrived and took over the kitchen. The morning passed. Margaret worked at the accounts in the library, but she was aware of the distant sound of work going on outside, the knock of a hammer, the creak of timber, Owen's voice carrying faintly on the damp air. She did not go to look. She finished the accounts and wrote her letter to her sister, and then gave in to the small pull of curiosity, and went to stand at the library window, which faced the garden rather than the east boundary. But Mr. Ashford appeared in the garden at noon anyway, coming around the side of the house with Owen behind him. Both of them were muddy from the knee down. Mr. Ashford was carrying a hammer that did not belong to him, and he looked, Margaret thought, more awake and more alive than he had over the supper table the night before. He saw her at the window and stopped. She opened the window. "How is the fence?" "Standing," he said. "It will hold through winter." "Good," she said. "Come and eat." She had not meant to phrase it quite like that. It came out sounding more like something she might say to someone who lived here and was expected at the table. She saw something flicker in his expression, amusement perhaps, or something gentler, and then he nodded and went around to the door. Lunch was the best meal of the day at Hartwell House. Cook had made a pot of soup from the last of the autumn vegetables, and there was bread still warm from the oven, and a small dish of hard cheese. Mr. Ashford ate 3 bowls of soup without comment. Owen was given a plate in the kitchen. "You are good with your hands," Margaret said. He looked up. "My father believed that a man who could not do something himself had no business asking others to do it for him." "A good principle," she said. "He was a difficult man," said Mr. Ashford, "but he had good principles." She understood that particular combination very well. She had known people like that. People who were right about things, and hard to love because of it. After lunch, the rain lifted briefly. Not fully. The sky stayed the color of old pewter, but the drizzle stopped, and a thin, pale light came through the clouds. It was the kind of light that October sometimes offered as a reminder that the sun still existed, even if it was not particularly interested in the current situation. Margaret went outside. She had a habit of walking the estate in the afternoon, even in poor weather. Not a long walk, just far enough to see what needed seeing. The garden, the outbuildings, the lane as far as the gate. She had done it every day for 11 years, with her husband beside her, and for the last 2 years alone. And the shape of the walk was so familiar that she could do it without thinking. She was past the garden gate when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Mr. Ashford was pulling on his coat. "Do you mind company?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. She should have said yes. She minded. It was proper. He was a guest, and she was the widow who owned the house, and there were rules about these things. Rules she had grown up understanding, and had followed carefully all her life. "No," she said. "I don't mind." They walked. She showed him the estate in the same way she always walked it, not narrating, just moving, letting the land speak for itself. The kitchen garden with its winter roots still in the ground. The old barn where the cart horses spent the cold months. The orchard where the last few hard apples clung to the bare branches. The east fields, still wet, dark brown and flat under the thin light. He walked beside her and asked questions. Not polite questions, the kind people asked when they were not listening to the answers. Real questions. He wanted to know how many acres the east fields were, and what they yielded in a good year. He wanted to know about the drainage near the river, which she had been concerned about for 3 seasons. He asked about the orchard, whether the trees were old or newer plantings, and what kind they were. And when she told him they were a mix, some 60 years old, and some her husband had planted when they married, he was quiet for a moment. "He planted trees he wouldn't live to see fully grown," Mr. Ashford said. "He was that kind of man," said Margaret. He did not say anything else, but something in his face shifted. She thought, watching him, that he was the kind of person who felt things with great depth and had learned, through long practice, to feel them quietly. They reached the gate at the end of the lane. The broken carriage was still in the ditch, dark and wet, a wheel-shaped absence in the mud beside it. He stopped and looked at it. "I sent a message to my secretary," he said. "Yesterday, from the road. He will be expecting news by now." "Mrs. Poole can send word through the postwriter who comes on Thursday," Margaret said. "That is 2 days away." "Yes." She looked at him. "Are you expected urgently somewhere?" He was quiet for a moment. "I am always expected somewhere," he said at last. "That is the difficulty." She did not know what he meant by that exactly. She thought about asking. She decided not to. "Then Thursday," she said, and turned back toward the house. He fell into step beside her again. They walked in silence for a while, and it was the same comfortable silence as breakfast, the kind that had weight and warmth to it without needing to be filled. "This is a very peaceful place," he said eventually. "It is," she agreed. "Do you find it lonely?" She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to consider things. "Sometimes," she said, "at particular hours, early evening, and when there is something interesting and no one nearby to tell." He glanced at her. "What do you do then?" "I write it in a letter to my sister," she said, "or I remember it carefully and save it." He was quiet for a moment. "Save it for what?" "For when someone is nearby," she said simply. He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the lane ahead. But she was aware, in the precise and careful way she was aware of most things, that he was looking at her in the same way he looked at the estate, not casually, not politely, but with the full and focused attention of someone trying to understand something that mattered to him. That evening, after supper, they sat in the library. There was no formal agreement about how they spent the evenings. It simply happened that after the meal was cleared, they both found their way to the same room. Mrs. Poole had learned to bring a second candle and to leave without comment. Tonight Mr. Ashford had the old estate book on his knee. He had been reading it properly now, not just holding it. She could tell by the way he turned the pages, slowly, revisiting. "There is a passage here," he said, "about the duty of landowners to understand the land they own." He looked up. "The author says that most men own land the way most men wear hats, because it is expected, without any particular relationship to it. My husband believed that," Margaret said. "He used to say the land knows who tends it. Do you believe that?" She looked at the fire. "I think the land does not know anything, because it is land," she said. "But I think the people who live on it and work it know very quickly whether the person responsible for it cares about it or not, and they respond accordingly." Mr. Ashford looked at her with great attention. "That is a better version of what the book says," he said. She smiled. She was looking at the fire, and he was looking at her, and she knew it, and she did not look away from the fire. "May I ask you something?" he said. "You may ask," she said. "When your husband died, was there ever any pressure on you to sell the estate, to give it up?" She was quiet for a moment. "From the moment the funeral was over," she said. His brother, who was a kind enough man in other respects, appeared with several good reasons why a woman alone could not manage land of this size. My husband's solicitor agreed with him. My father, who was still alive then, wrote to say that the sensible thing was to let it go. And I thanked them all for their concern," she said, "and kept the estate." He said nothing for a moment. She looked at him then. He was watching her with something in his face that she had not seen there before. It was not simple admiration. It was deeper than that. It was the expression of someone who had just recognized something they had been looking for, without knowing they were looking. "You didn't consider it?" he asked. "I considered it for approximately one morning," she said. "Then I looked out at the fields and thought about my husband planting those apple trees, and I decided I was going to tend them until they were old enough to not need tending. After that, whoever wants the land is welcome to it." The fire crackled. The candle flame shifted in a small draft from the window. "I think," Mr. Ashford said carefully, "that you are one of the most determined people I have ever met." She looked back at the fire. "I think," she said, "that you are the only person who has ever meant that as a compliment." "I mean it entirely as a compliment," he said. The clock on the shelf ticked. The rain had stopped outside. In the sudden absence of it, the night was very quiet. Margaret looked at the fire and thought, "This is not going to be simple." She was right. Mrs. Poole had worked in service for 31 years. She had worked in 4 different households over that time, beginning as a kitchen girl in a house in Lincolnshire when she was 14, and rising through the work slowly and carefully until she reached the position she now held. She had learned, in 31 years of service, that the most important skill in a house was not cooking or cleaning or account keeping, though all of those mattered. The most important skill was seeing. Not watching, seeing. There was a difference. Watching was what people did when they were curious, or nosy, or looking for something to say. Seeing was what you did when you paid attention to a household the way a good gardener paid attention to a garden. Not to the individual plants, but to the whole of it, the balance of it, the way things grew or failed to grow. Mrs. Poole had been seeing Hartwell House for 4 years. She knew its patterns the way she knew her own hands. She knew that Mrs. Hartwell woke before dawn and put the kettle on herself when she thought no one was watching. She knew that the mistress of the house cried exactly once a year, on the anniversary of Mr. Hartwell's death, and only in the late afternoon, when the light turned gold, and she thought she was alone. She knew that the estate accounts were kept with a precision that would have impressed a solicitor, and that the vegetable garden was managed with a love that had nothing to do with practicality. She knew all of this, and she knew, on the 3rd morning of Mr. Ashford's visit, that something had changed in the house. It was not one thing, it was everything together. It was the way Mrs. Hartwell had stood in the kitchen doorway the previous afternoon, watching Mr. Ashford walk through the garden, not aware that she was standing there for a full minute before she moved. It was the way the evening conversations had shifted from the polite back and forth of host and guest to something quieter and more careful, with long pauses that had warmth in them. It was the way the house felt different, not louder, because neither of them was a loud person, but fuller, more inhabited. The way a room felt when you opened the windows after a long winter. Mrs. Poole noticed all of this, and she was glad of it, and she said nothing. What she did not say anything about, because she was not the kind of woman who stirred up trouble, was what she had seen on the side of the ruined carriage. She had gone down to the gate on the first morning to inspect the damage, not because it was her responsibility, but because she liked to know the full shape of a situation. The carriage was expensive. That had been immediately clear. The quality of the wood, the hardware on the doors, the style of the wheelwork even in its broken state, these were not the marks of a gentleman of modest means passing through the country. These were the marks of serious, old, significant wealth. She had looked more closely, and she had seen the crest. It was on the door panel, small but clear, a quartered shield with a hawk in the upper left, and what appeared to be a river in the lower right, topped with a coronet. She had seen that crest before, years ago, in a house where she had briefly worked, before the family reduced their staff. She had seen it on letters, on silver, on the corners of curtains in the formal rooms. The Ashford crest. She stood in the wet lane for a long moment, looking at it. Then she turned and walked back to the house. The Duke of Ashworth was asleep in the blue room with the fireplace, under a wool blanket that needed darning, eating cooked soup from old pottery that had belonged to the previous generation of Hartwells. He had introduced himself as Mr. Ashford. He had not lied exactly. Ashford was his family name, but he had omitted rather a great deal. Mrs. Poole thought about this for the rest of that first day, and through the second. She thought about it with the steady, practical part of her mind that had been working through difficult situations for 31 years. She thought about telling Mrs. Hartwell immediately. It was the obvious thing to do. Transparency in a household was a value she believed in. Her mistress deserved to know who was under her roof. But she had also watched, over those first 2 days, what happened when that knowledge was absent. She had watched Mrs. Hartwell be herself, completely, and without any of the adjustments that women of her position made, when they knew they were in the presence of a title. No stiffness, no careful phrasing, no arranging of herself to be appropriate. Just Mrs. Hartwell, direct, practical, funny when she chose to be, and entirely at ease in a way she had not been with any visitor Mrs. Poole could remember. And she had watched Mr. Ashford, the Duke of Ashworth, be something she suspected he was not often permitted to be either. Quiet, useful, present, not managing a situation or presiding over a room, but simply existing in one, eating soup and fixing fences and borrowing books and asking questions that nobody important ever asked. Mrs. Poole was not sentimental. She was not the sort of woman who told herself stories about how things ought to go. But she had been watching people in houses for 31 years, and she had learned to recognize the particular rarity of two people being honestly themselves in each other's company. She made a decision. She would not tell Mrs. Hartwell today. Not yet. Not while the road was still flooded, and the carriage was still in the ditch, and the situation had not resolved itself into anything that required action. She would wait, and see, and keep her own counsel. She pulled Owen aside in the kitchen on the second evening. Owen was 19, quick, and sharper than he sometimes let on. "I need you to do something for me," she said, keeping her voice low. Owen looked at her carefully. He was standing by the stove, warming his hands, and his expression shifted into the focused look he wore when he understood that something serious was being asked of him. "What did you see on the carriage?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The crest, Mrs. Poole." "Yes," she said. "What do you know about it?" He shook his head. "Not much. I know it's not a small family." "It is not a small family," she said quietly. "I need you to say nothing about it. To Cook, to the girl, to anyone. Can you do that?" He looked at her steadily. "Is the mistress safe?" She considered this. "Yes," she said. "She is perfectly safe. He is not that kind of man." Owen nodded once. "Then I won't say anything." "Good." She went back to her own work. She had a household to run, and a third full day of extra laundry and cooking, and firekeeping to manage. She did these things with her usual efficiency, and kept the secret pressed flat inside her, where it sat like a coin in the bottom of a drawer, present, weighty, but not in the way. The third day began with a small miracle. The rain had stopped overnight. Not just eased, stopped. When Mrs. Poole opened the back door at 5 in the morning, the air was cold and still and dry. The sky was clearing from the west, and there was a strip of dark blue above the tree line that in another 2 hours would be pale dawn light. The mud in the lane was still deep, but the lane itself was visible as a lane again, rather than a stream. Mrs. Poole stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed the clean, cold air. The road to Ashton would still be flooded for part of today. The wheelwright could not come before tomorrow at earliest. One more full day, perhaps a morning after that. She went inside and began preparing breakfast. She was aware, as she worked, of what one more day meant. She was aware of what it would mean when it ended. She was aware that Mrs. Hartwell had been moving through the house for the past 3 days, in a particular kind of suspension, not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it, something alive, something that had not been there before the storm. And she was aware that when the Duke of Ashworth stepped back into his proper world, he would be bringing that suspension to an end, in a way that could not be predicted and could not be controlled. She cracked eggs into a bowl and beat them steadily, and thought about it. There was a part of her that thought she had made a mistake, that she should have told Mrs. Hartwell on the first morning, before any of this had time to settle, that transparency was always better than the alternative. But there was another part, the 31 years part, the watching part, that thought something else. That perhaps the mistake was in thinking that what was happening here was something that needed to be protected against. That perhaps two people being honestly themselves with each other, even for 3 days, and even across a gap as large as the one that would soon be revealed, was not something to be sorry for. Not all of it would be simple, she knew that. But simple was not the same as worthless. She put the eggs on, and heard footsteps on the stairs and thought, one more day. Whatever it is worth, one more day. Mrs. Hartwell appeared first, as she always did, quiet and clear-eyed, her hair pinned neatly, and her sleeves already rolled up, as though she expected work before breakfast. She looked at the clean sky through the window. "It stopped," she said. "Stopped completely," said Mrs. Poole. A pause. Mrs. Hartwell looked at the sky for a moment longer. Something crossed her face. Not sadness, not exactly, but a kind of careful preparation. The way a person looked when they could see a thing coming toward them, and were deciding how to receive it. Then she turned back to the room. "Good," she said. "Breakfast." She said it in her usual practical voice. Mrs. Poole looked at her and said nothing, and went on beating the eggs, and kept the coin weight of her secret pressed flat in the drawer, for one more day. Downstairs, in the kitchen, Cook was slicing bread, and the morning was beginning in its ordinary way, except for the one extraordinary thing that sat beneath it, like a stone beneath water, present, solid, and waiting to be felt. And upstairs, in the blue room with the fireplace, a man who was not simply Mr. Ashford was already awake. Mrs. Poole heard his footsteps above her. She heard him cross the room. She heard him stand at the window for a long moment. She could tell by the stillness of it, looking out at the clearing sky. Then she heard him sit back down. She did not know what he was thinking. She was not a woman who invented things she could not know, but she thought, as she moved efficiently through the kitchen, and set the table and prepared for another morning that would be the last ordinary one for some time, that whatever he was thinking, it had the same quality as what had crossed Mrs. Hartwell's face when she saw the clear sky. Not sadness, not exactly, but a careful preparation, a reading of what was coming, a quiet and private gathering of something that had been, for a few days, unexpectedly easy, and was about to become, once again, complicated. She set the teapot on the table. She went to the bottom of the stairs and called up that breakfast was ready, and the house began its day. The morning the sky cleared was also the morning the letter arrived. Margaret had not expected it. She was in the garden at mid-morning, cutting the last of the season's growth from the rose bushes, when she heard the sound of hooves on the lane. Not the heavy hooves of a working horse. Light, quick hooves. A rider, rather than a vehicle. She stood up from where she had been crouching beside the far bed, and looked toward the gate. A young man in a dark coat pulled up at the gate and called out. One of the household boys ran to meet him. There was a brief exchange. The rider handed over a sealed letter, and turned his horse, and was gone in under 2 minutes. Mrs. Poole appeared at the garden door with the letter in her hand. It was not addressed to Mrs. Hartwell. It was addressed to the Duke of Ashworth. Mrs. Poole's face was composed. It was always composed. But Margaret was good at reading composed faces. She had spent 11 years learning to read her husband's, and after that, she had had 2 years of reading her own in the mirror, and she saw, behind the composure, a very particular kind of careful stillness. "Who is it for?" Margaret said. She had already seen the name on the front, but she asked. "Mr. Ashford," Mrs. Poole said. She paused. Then, without another word, she turned and went inside. Margaret stood in the garden for a moment, with the trowel in her hand, and looked at nothing in particular. The Duke of Ashworth. She said it in her mind very quietly, once, the way you tested the weight of something before you picked it up. Then she set down the trowel, took off her gardening gloves, and went inside. She found Mrs. Poole waiting in the hall with the letter still in her hand. They looked at each other. "How long have you known?" Margaret asked. The housekeeper's expression did not change, but her eyes, which were sharp and honest, told the truth immediately. "Since the first morning," she said, "the crest on the carriage door." Margaret absorbed this. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said nothing." "No, ma'am." A long pause. Margaret looked at the letter. Then she looked at Mrs. Poole. "Take it up to him," she said. Mrs. Poole went upstairs. Margaret went to the front room and stood at the window and looked out at the lane where the broken carriage was still sitting in its ditch, mud-dark and patient. The sky above the tree line was the pale, washed blue that October saved for its clearest days, and the light was very clean and very cold. She heard footsteps above her. She heard the murmur of Mrs. Poole's voice, and then nothing. Then footsteps again, and the creak of the stairs, and he was in the doorway behind her. She did not turn around immediately. She kept her eyes on the carriage in the ditch. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that I may need a different form of address." A long pause. "I should have told you," he said, "on the first night." She turned then. He was standing in the doorway with the opened letter in his hand, and his face was the most unguarded she had seen it. All the careful stillness gone, replaced by something simpler and more exposed. He looked like a man waiting to find out whether he had done something unforgivable. "Why didn't you?" she asked. It was a real question, not an accusation. She genuinely wanted to understand. He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked into the room and stood beside the window, a few feet from her, and looked out at the same view she had been looking at. The broken carriage, the clear sky, the muddy lane. "Because I wanted to eat supper and talk about the land without the title sitting between us," he said. "Because people behave differently when they know who I am. Because—" He stopped. He was quiet for a moment. "Because for one evening, I wanted to simply be a man whose carriage had broken." Margaret looked at him. "And then it was the second evening," he said. "And then the third. And each day, it became harder to say it, because each day, it would have been more of a betrayal of what had already been honest between us." She thought about this carefully. She thought about the evenings by the fire, about the walk through the estate, about the questions he had asked that no one else had asked, about handing him her husband's book. You let me speak to you as an equal, she said. You are an equal, he said immediately, and with such directness that she blinked. She looked out the window. The carriage in the ditch had not moved. It would need to be dealt with. The wheelwright from Ashton would be sent for today. By tomorrow, there would be a vehicle in the lane. By the day after, he would be gone. I am not angry, she said at last. He turned to look at her. I understand it, she said. I even understand why Mrs. Poole didn't tell me. I don't like it exactly, but I understand it. She looked at him. I am, however, going to need some time to rearrange things in my mind.
What things? He asked.
The things I said to you, she said. Knowing what I now know about the gap between us, I need to reconsider whether any of it was. She paused.
Appropriate.
Something came into his face. It was not quite pain, but it was close to it. Don't, he said. She looked at him. Please don't do that, he said quietly. Don't go back and change what was said. The conversations we had these 3 days were the most honest I have had in years. Don't make them into something they were not by measuring them against a title. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a bird moved through the bare apple trees at the far end of the garden. The cold light fell straight and clean across the wet lawn. You are due somewhere, she said. I am always due somewhere, he said. It was the same thing he had said before, and it had the same quality to it. Resigned, weary, carrying the weight of a life that had many obligations and very few choices. Then you should go, she said. Today, if the road is clear enough. Tomorrow at the latest. He looked at her for a long time. May I write to you? He asked. She turned toward the window again. That would not be appropriate, she said. Silence. You said you were not angry, he said. I am not, she said. But there is a difference between not being angry and pretending that what you have just told me does not change the situation. She looked at him. You are the Duke of Ashworth. I am a widow who manages a modest estate and cannot afford to repair a mill. Those are real things. I would rather acknowledge them than pretend they do not exist. He looked at her with an expression that she had not seen on anyone's face in a very long time. It was the expression of someone watching something they wanted very much walk away from them, and knowing that they had no right to argue against it. All right, he said quietly. The letter in his hand crinkled faintly as his grip shifted. She noticed it. She looked away. I'll ask Mrs. Poole to send word to the wheelwright this morning, she said. He nodded once. She left the room. She went to the kitchen and spoke to Mrs. Poole, and then went to her own room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor for a while. It was not grief exactly. It was not shock. It was the particular feeling that came with a door closing on something that had, for a few days, felt as though it might open further. She told herself she had handled it correctly. She had been sensible. She had looked at the facts of the situation and responded to them with the same practical clarity she brought to everything. She sat on the edge of the bed, and the morning light moved across the floor, and she was perfectly sensible about the whole thing. Except that she was also aware, in the quiet and honest part of herself that she rarely showed to anyone, that she had just sent away the most interesting person she had met in years, and that the house was going to be very, very quiet when he was gone. She stood up. She smoothed her dress. She went back to work. That was what you did. That was always what you did. It did not make the afternoon any less quiet. And the afternoon, with its pale clean light and its birdsong in the bare trees and its absence of footsteps anywhere but her own, was the longest she had experienced in 2 years. The letter from his secretary arrived the same morning the rider had come, with the redirected post. It was brief, as the secretary's letters always were, and it contained 3 pieces of information. The first was a reminder of the meeting scheduled for Monday at the estate office in the north. The second was a note about a matter of accounts that required a decision. The third was a single line at the bottom, underlined, "The family expects you at Ashworth Hall by the end of the fortnight." James folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his coat and stood at the window of the blue room for a long time. Below him, the garden was pale and bright in the morning light. He could see the bare rose beds where Margaret had been working. The trowel was still on the edge of one of the beds, left where she had set it down when the rider came. He thought about the expression on her face when she had come inside after seeing the letter. Not anger. Worse than anger, in a way. The careful, deliberate composure of a woman who had decided to be sensible about something she did not want to be sensible about. He had watched her do it. He had watched the decision move across her face, and he had known exactly what she was deciding, and exactly why. And he had not been able to argue against it, because she was right. She was right about all of it. The gap between them was real. The complications were real. The appropriate response to a duke appearing uninvited in your life by way of a broken carriage in a ditch was not to allow anything to develop from it, because nothing that developed from it would be simple, or protected, or easy. She was right. He put on his coat and went downstairs. The house was quiet. He walked through the hall and out the front door, and stood in the cold morning air, and looked at the gate, and the lane, and the broken carriage in the ditch. Owen was already down at the carriage, examining the damage in the daylight. The young man straightened when he saw James coming, and gave him a careful, neutral look. "How bad is it?" James asked. "Bad enough," said Owen. "The axle needs replacing, not just the wheel. The wheelwright will have to bring the right timber." "How long?" 2 days to get it done, I'd say, once he arrives. If he arrives today, we could perhaps leave the day after tomorrow." James stood and looked at the carriage for a long moment. 2 more days. 2 more meals in the dining room, with the east-facing window, and the simple pottery, and the food that tasted better than food had tasted, and he could not remember how long. 2 more evenings in the front room, where the fire burned, and the clock ticked, and Margaret Hartwell sat with a book, and said exactly what she meant, and expected him to do the same. He thought about what she had said, that she needed to rearrange things in her mind, that she needed to reconsider whether what she had said was appropriate, now that she knew the gap between them. It had been the most painful sentence anyone had said to him in years. Not because it was cruel, it was not, it was simply honest, but because of what it revealed, that the conversations, the evenings, the walk through the estate, the book, the silence by the fire, all of it had already been important enough to her that she needed to go back and reassess it. People did not reassess things that did not matter. He understood why she had asked him to go. He understood why she would not permit letters. He understood the practical calculation she was making, and he respected it, because she was a person who deserved to be respected. He also understood, with the same quiet certainty that had settled on him over 3 days of soup and fence posts and borrowed books, that he was not going to simply get in the repaired carriage and drive north and never think about this again. He did not know what he was going to do instead. He did not know what was right or proper or even possible. He was the Duke of Ashworth. His life was arranged, had been arranged since birth, in a very particular way, with very particular people, in very particular places. He had a secretary who sent underlined reminders about family expectations. He had an estate that required constant management. He had a position that came with demands he could not simply set aside, because he had spent 3 days in a quiet house and eaten good soup, and felt, for the first time in years, like a person rather than a title. But he also had something else now. He had the memory of a woman telling him that she saved interesting things to share with someone when someone was nearby. He had the memory of her handing him a book that belonged to her husband. He had the memory of her face in the morning light of the kitchen at 5 o'clock, before she knew he was there, when she was completely and unconsciously herself. He stood by the broken carriage for a long time. Then he went back inside and wrote a letter to his secretary. The letter said that he would be delayed for 2 more days, that the road was still unsuitable, that all matters requiring decision should wait until his return. It said nothing about Hartwell House, or its owner, or the broken carriage, or the 3 days that had passed. He sealed it and gave it to Mrs. Poole to be sent with the Thursday post. Lunch was quiet. Margaret sat at her end of the table and was pleasant and practical, and did not meet his eyes more than was necessary. She asked Owen about the carriage. She told James, she was still calling him Mr. Ashford, he noticed, the small formal distance of it, that the wheelwright had been sent for, and was expected tomorrow morning. "Good," James said. "The road to the north should be passable by then," she added. "The flooding at the river crossing usually drains within 24 hours of the rain stopping." "I appreciate the information," he said. They ate. The soup was good. The bread was good. Everything at this table was good, and the dining room faced east and caught the afternoon light, and the room smelled of wood smoke and something warm from the kitchen, and he sat across from a woman who was being very carefully composed and who was eating her soup without looking at him. And he thought, I am going to come back here. He did not say it. It was not the right moment, and he was not certain he had earned the right to say it, and she had already told him that a letter would not be appropriate. He had no grounds to announce a return visit. But he thought it, clearly and steadily, the way he thought about things that were true. In the afternoon, he sat in the small writing room and finished his work. He worked efficiently, as he always did, moving through the papers with the focused attention of a man accustomed to managing a great deal simultaneously. But he was aware, underneath the work, of the sounds of the house around him. Margaret moving between rooms, Mrs. Poole's brisk footsteps in the hall, the sound of wood being stacked somewhere outside, the ordinary, quiet, human sounds of a house being properly lived in. He finished his work before 4 o'clock, which was unusual. He tidied the papers and sat for a moment in the chair with his hands flat on the desk. Then he picked up the old estate book, which he had carried down from his room that morning, and read until supper. The book was extraordinary, not because of its information, though the information was good, but because of who had read it before him. He could see the marks of that reading everywhere, faint pencil notations in the margins, a page corner turned down, a small underlined passage about the relationship between a landowner and the people who worked the land. The handwriting in the margins was a man's hand, different from Margaret's, and it was engaged and curious, and occasionally disagreed with the text in small, precise ways. He read those marginal notes as carefully as he read the text. He felt, reading them, that he was learning something about the kind of man Edmund Hartwell had been. And he felt, knowing what he now knew about the woman who had continued everything Edmund Hartwell built, that the two of them had been very well suited. He thought about what she had said, that her husband had planted apple trees he would not live to see fully grown. He set the book down and looked out the window at the garden, where those trees were standing, bare and patient in the October light. He thought about something his own father had said to him once, years ago, when James was young enough to still think that strength meant never wanting anything you could not immediately have. His father had said, "The things worth having are the ones that require you to be patient enough to deserve them." His father had been a difficult man, with good principles. James picked the book back up and kept reading. Supper that evening was different from the nights before. It was not uncomfortable. Margaret would not permit discomfort at her table, he had come to understand, the same way she did not permit carelessness in her accounts or inattention in her garden. But it was quieter. The particular easy silence of the previous evenings had given way to something more careful, something that was aware of itself. They spoke about ordinary things, the wheelwright's expected arrival, the frost that Cook had predicted, the state of the East Fields, practical, factual things that required no navigation. After supper, Mrs. Poole brought tea to the front room. Margaret sat with hers and looked at the fire. James sat across from her with the estate book and read. After a long silence, Margaret said, "Do you know the history of the Ashworth title?" He looked up. Her eyes were still on the fire. "My grandfather," he said, "second generation. He was the one who bought the hall." "Bought it," she said, "not inherited." "No, earned it." He paused. He was not born to it. Neither was his son. By the time it reached me, people had forgotten that, but it was not always a title with deep roots. She looked at him then. "You don't seem like someone who forgot." "I try not to," he said. A pause. "Then why," she said quietly, "did you spend 3 days pretending to be something smaller than what you are, when the truth of what you are already includes the understanding that a title is not the whole of a person?" It was the most direct thing she had said all day. It arrived without warning and hit the center of something. He was quiet for a moment. Then, because I knew what would change if I said it, and I wanted, just for a little while, for things not to change. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. "Did they?" he asked. "Change?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. And then, before he could respond, "But perhaps not entirely in the way I expected." He waited. She looked back at the fire. "I expected to feel foolish," she said, "for not knowing, for saying things I might not have said if I had known. She paused, "for the conversations." "And do you?" he asked. "Feel foolish?" "No," she said. She sounded faintly surprised by it. That is what I am still working out. He said nothing. He let the silence sit. He had learned, these 3 days, that Margaret Hartwell worked through things at her own pace and in her own way, and that the most useful thing he could do while she did so was to remain present and quiet. I think, she said at last, that the conversations were exactly what they were. They were honest, and the fact that I would have been more careful with them if I had known does not mean that the honest versions were wrong. She looked at him. It just means that I said true things to someone I did not fully know. Is that so terrible? He said. No, she said. It's just unusual. The fire settled. The evening was very quiet. Outside, the first frost of October had begun to lay itself softly across the garden, silvering the bare rose canes and the empty herb beds, and the old apple trees at the far end, patient and still in the cold dark. James looked at the woman across from him and thought, again, clearly and steadily, I am coming back here. She was looking at the fire again. Her profile in the firelight was calm and unreadable, and he had spent 3 days learning the difference between her composed face and her thinking face, and this was her thinking face, which meant she was not as finished with this as she was trying to appear. He picked up the book. He read. She looked at the fire. The clock ticked, and outside, the frost settled on Hartwell House like a clean white certainty, and the broken carriage sat in the frozen mud of the lane, and the apple trees stood in the dark with their roots in the ground, patient and permanent, growing slowly toward something none of them could yet see. There is a particular kind of cold that belongs only to England in late October, and it arrived the morning James Ashford, the Duke of Ashworth, left Hartwell House. It came in through the windows before dawn, the kind of cold that settled into the corners of rooms and made the floors creak differently, and turned the breath to mist even indoors, near the fire. Margaret noticed it when she rose, and she noticed it more when she stood at the kitchen window with her tea and watched the frost-silver lawn and the pale morning sky, and listened to the sound of boots on the floorboards above her. The wheelwright had arrived the previous morning and had worked through the day and into the early evening. The carriage was repaired. It sat at the gate now, whole again, dark and silent, and very much capable of taking someone away. Margaret drank her tea and thought about nothing in particular, and thought about everything at once. Owen appeared in the yard at first light, loading bags into the back of the carriage, with the steady efficiency of someone who had packed and unpacked at a dozen different houses, and had long since stopped attaching feelings to the process. He was good at his job. He did not look toward the house. Mrs. Poole appeared in the kitchen with a basket. "I've packed bread and some cold meat, and the rest of the apple cake," she said, "for the journey north." Margaret looked at the basket. "He didn't ask for that." "No," said Mrs. Poole. "But it's 4 hours to Carlton at least, and the coaching inns on that road are worse every year." Margaret nodded. She did not say anything else. He came downstairs at 7:30. He was dressed for travel, the dark coat, the good boots, a hat that had been brushed clean by Owen. He looked, in his traveling clothes, more like who he was, more formal, more contained. The 3 days of fence posts and evening fires and borrowed books had given him a certain ease that his traveling coat now asked him to set aside. He came to the kitchen doorway and stopped when he saw Margaret at the window. She turned. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He looked at the basket on the table. "You didn't have to." "Mrs. Poole did," Margaret said. "You should thank her." He looked at Mrs. Poole, who was pouring tea at the stove with her back to him. "Thank you, Mrs. Poole," he said. "Safe traveling, sir," she said, without turning around. Her voice was perfectly even. He sat down at the kitchen table. Margaret brought him a cup of tea and sat across from him, and they had breakfast together one last time. The food was simple. The morning light was flat and gray. Neither of them said anything for a while. "The book," he said suddenly. Margaret looked at him. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out the small brown volume. He set it on the table between them. "I should not take it," he said. She looked at it for a moment. Her husband's book. The one she had watched sit on the shelf for 2 years without touching. She looked at the hand that had set it on the table. "Keep it," she said. He looked at her. "My husband would have liked knowing someone was still reading it," she said. "Keep it." He picked it up slowly and put it back in his pocket. He looked at her across the table with the expression she had come to know best of all the expressions he wore. The unguarded one. The one that came through when his careful stillness ran out. "Margaret," he said. She shook her head, just slightly, not harshly. Just a small, clear movement that said, "Please don't. Not now. Not this way." He heard it. He closed his mouth. They finished their tea in silence. At 8 o'clock, Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway to say the carriage was ready. James stood. He straightened his coat. He picked up the basket Mrs. Poole had packed. Margaret walked with him to the front door, down the hall, past the library, past the sitting room where the lamp on the desk had burned every evening of his stay. She opened the front door, and the cold morning air came in, clean and sharp and full of the particular smell of frozen ground. He stepped out onto the front step and turned. They stood looking at each other for a moment. "I know you said letters would not be appropriate," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know why you said it," he said, "and I am not going to argue with it." "Good," she said. "But I want to say one thing," he said, "before I go. Not as the Duke of Ashworth, and not as Mr. Ashford either. Just as the man whose carriage broke in your ditch." She looked at him. "These 3 days," he said, "were the most honest days I have spent in a very long time. I am grateful for them, and I am sorry for not telling you the truth on the first night." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold air moved between them. The carriage waited at the gate. "I believe you," she said. "Both things." He nodded once. Then he stepped down from the step and walked down the lane to the gate. Owen held the carriage door. James climbed in. He did not look back through the window. She had not expected him to. He was too controlled a person for that kind of gesture. And she was glad of it, because she was not certain what her face was doing, and she preferred not to be seen in uncertain moments. The carriage moved. The wheels turned on the gravel, and then on the lane, and then quieter still on the road, and in a few minutes, the sound of it had faded into the morning, and was gone. Margaret stood in the open door for another minute. The lane was empty. The frost was melting slowly in the thin autumn light. The apple trees at the end of the garden stood in their patient rows. She went inside and closed the door. "Should I clear the guest room?" Mrs. Poole asked from the hallway. "Please," Margaret said. She went to her study and sat down at the desk. She had work to do. There were always accounts to attend to, and a letter to write to her sister, and a decision to make about the mill. The ordinary work of the ordinary life she had built carefully over many years. She picked up her pen. She set it down. She looked at the window. What she was feeling was not grief. She had known grief. She had learned its particular weight and texture, and the specific way it settled in the chest, and this was not that. This was lighter and stranger, more like the feeling after a good book ended, the peculiar emptiness of a world that had briefly been fuller than usual, suddenly being its ordinary size again. She picked up the pen again. She began the letter to her sister. She wrote about the frost, and the mill, and the accounts. She wrote nothing about the storm, or the carriage, or the man who had sat in the front room for 3 evenings and asked her questions that no one else had thought to ask. She did not write any of that. But she thought it, carefully and completely, the way she had once told him she saved interesting things, pressing it into memory, keeping it for the right moment, whenever that moment came. She finished the letter. She sealed it. She went to the window and looked out at the empty lane. Down the road, somewhere in the distance, a carriage was moving north through the cold October morning. Inside it, a man with an old book in his pocket was looking at the road ahead of him and thinking things that no one would have asked him about and that he would not have shared if they had. The house was very quiet. Margaret went back to work. 3 weeks after the Duke of Ashworth drove his repaired carriage north along the road from Hartwell, a letter arrived. It was not addressed to Margaret Hartwell. It was addressed, in formal and careful handwriting, to the widow Hartwell of Hartwell House, Buckinghamshire, and it arrived with the morning post on a Tuesday, when the frost had finally given way to a gray, still cold, that felt more serious than anything before it. Mrs. Poole brought it to Margaret at the desk in her study, and set it beside the letter from her solicitor that Margaret had been ignoring for 3 days. She did not say anything. She simply set it down and left. Margaret looked at it. The handwriting on the front was not his. It was precise and formal, a secretary's hand, but the wax seal on the back was his. She opened it carefully. The letter was brief. It was written on heavy paper, and the handwriting, where it appeared at the bottom after the formal opening, changed to something less careful, more direct. It said this: "I promised not to write. I find I cannot keep that promise, though I have tried. I do not know what the correct thing is to ask or to say. I know only that I have returned to my house in the north, and found it, as I expected, full of work, and I have found something else in it that I did not expect, the very clear and settled understanding that I need to come back and speak to you properly, not as Mr. Ashford, not from behind a cracked axle and a storm, as who I am, in full, to who you are, in full. I will come to Hartwell in the new year, if you will permit it. If you will not, I will accept that completely, and will not write again. You have only to say so, and I will respect it." He had not signed it with a title. He had signed it, James Ashford. Margaret read the letter twice. She set it flat on the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer of her writing desk, below the accounts ledger, where she put things she had not yet decided about. She picked up her pen and went back to work. For 3 days, the letter stayed in the drawer. She was aware of it the way you were aware of something in the corner of a room, not looking at it directly, but knowing it was there, registering its presence in the small, persistent way that mattered things registered. She attended to the household accounts and wrote back to the solicitor about the mill, and had a long and useful conversation with Mr. Graves about the Eastfield drainage, and lived her ordinary, well-ordered life in exactly the way she always lived it. On the 4th day, her sister arrived. Eleanor had written to say she was coming. The letter had arrived a week ago, and Margaret had noted it and arranged for the east-facing bedroom to be aired, and had not thought very much about it beyond the practical preparations. Eleanor visited twice a year. She was a kind and practical woman who had been married for 15 years to a good-natured solicitor in Bath, and who worried about Margaret with a steady, undramatic persistence that Margaret both appreciated and found occasionally exhausting. Eleanor arrived in a hired carriage on a Wednesday afternoon, slightly damp from the journey, full of energy and opinions, and the particular brand of older sister attention that had the warmth of genuine love and the sharpness of someone who noticed everything. She was in the hallway pulling off her coat when she looked at Margaret's face and said, "What's happened?" Margaret looked at her. "Good afternoon to you too, Eleanor." "Something's happened," Eleanor said, handing her coat to Mrs. Poole without looking away from Margaret. "You look different." "I look exactly the same," Margaret said. "You do not." Eleanor studied her with the focus of someone inspecting a painting they have known for a long time, and spotted a change in. "You look," she paused, "unsettled, in a way I haven't seen in a long time." "You have been traveling for 4 hours," Margaret said. "Come and sit down and have tea, and stop examining me." They had tea in the front room. Eleanor accepted a cup and a slice of cake, and looked around the room, with the eye of someone checking that the room was still the same room she had last seen it. It was. The books, the fireplace, the 2 chairs, the window, the small table between them. Her eyes rested on the chairs for a moment. There were 2 of them, both recently used, by the look of them. The cushions were settled differently from the way they settled when only one person used a room. Eleanor said nothing, but Margaret saw her notice. After tea, after Eleanor had unpacked and washed and changed her dress, and reappeared looking refreshed and slightly more restrained than she had been on arrival, they sat together in the front room, and Margaret told her. Not everything, not the evenings by the fire, or the walk through the estate, or the book she had given him, but the facts of it. The storm, the carriage, the man who had introduced himself as Mr. Ashford and stayed for 3 days, the morning the letter arrived, the seal she had recognized, the conversation that followed, and then the drawer, and what was in it. Eleanor was quiet for a long time when Margaret finished, longer than was usual for her. "The Duke of Ashworth," she said at last. "Yes," said Margaret. "He is one of the 10 wealthiest men in England. So I have been told. He sat in that chair for 3 evenings, eating Mrs. Poole's soup, and reading your husband's books." "Yes." Eleanor looked at the chair, then she looked at her sister. "And you told him a letter would not be appropriate." "At the time," Margaret said, "it seemed like the sensible thing to say." "And now?" Margaret looked at the fire. "Now I have a letter in my desk drawer that I have read twice and thought about for 4 days, and have not yet answered." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. She drank her tea. She set the cup down. Then she said, "Why haven't you answered it?" Margaret was quiet. "Margaret," her sister said, not impatiently, gently. "Why haven't you answered?" "Because I don't know what the right answer is," Margaret said. And it was the truth. And it cost her something to say it, because she was a woman who generally knew her own mind, and found uncertainty uncomfortable. "What does your mind say?" Eleanor asked. "My mind says it is complicated," Margaret said. "My mind says the gap between us is real, and cannot simply be wished away because 3 evenings were pleasant. My mind says that a duke writing to a widow he met in a storm is not." She paused. "It is not a small thing. It carries consequences. For the household, for the neighborhood, for you," Eleanor said quietly. "For me," Margaret said. Silence. "And what does the other thing say?" Eleanor asked. "The part that isn't your mind." Margaret looked at the fire for a long time. The clock ticked. Outside, the cold afternoon was settling into the early dark that October kept pulling toward November. "It says," Margaret said carefully, "that he signed the letter James Ashford and not the Duke of Ashworth, and that the difference matters." Eleanor looked at her, a long look, the kind of look that sisters gave each other when words were both necessary and insufficient. "Answer the letter," Eleanor said. "It is not that simple," Margaret said. "I know," her sister said, "but it is also not as complicated as you are making it." He asked a clear question. He said he would accept whatever you told him, so tell him something true. Margaret looked at her. "You have been alone in this house for 2 years," Eleanor said. "I have watched you run it, and manage it, and tend it with everything you have. I have also watched it be very quiet, and I have watched you be very composed about the quiet, and I have never once pushed you, because it was not my place, and you were not ready." She paused. "But you did not look like this before the storm, and you look like this now, and I think you know the difference." Margaret sat with that for a moment. The fire crackled. The room was warm. "He will come in the new year if I say yes," she said. "Yes," said Eleanor. "And what happens after that is unknown." "Yes," said Eleanor again. "That is generally how things work." Margaret looked at her sister. Eleanor looked back with the direct, calm expression of a woman who had spent 15 years watching her younger sister be sensible and had finally run out of patience with it. "I will think about it," Margaret said. "That means yes," said Eleanor. "It means I will think about it. It means yes." Eleanor picked up her teacup with the satisfied air of someone who has successfully concluded a negotiation. "Now tell me about this mill situation, because from what you wrote in your last letter, your steward is completely wrong about the rental value." Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then, despite everything, she laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, and it felt, she thought, like the first full breath she had taken in 3 weeks. She told her sister about the mill, and later that evening, after Eleanor had gone to bed, Margaret went to her study and opened the drawer and took out the letter. She read it one more time. She set it on the desk. She thought about what she wanted to say, and what was true, and whether those two things were different. She picked up her pen. She began to write. The autumn had become winter by the time the Duke of Ashworth received his reply. It arrived at his house in the north on a morning when the ground was hard and the sky was the flat, white gray of coming snow, and his secretary brought it to the library where James was working through a stack of correspondence that had been accumulating since his return. The secretary set the letter on the corner of the desk, at a slight distance from the official post, and withdrew without comment. He was a perceptive man, the secretary, and he had noticed, without remarking on it, that his employer had been working with a particular intensity for the past 3 weeks that had less to do with concentration and more to do with the controlled restlessness of a man who was waiting for something. James set down his pen. He looked at the letter. The handwriting on the front was neat and clear, the hand of someone who wrote often and thought about their words. He broke the seal. The letter was not long. It did not begin with elaborate preamble. It began very simply. It said, "You said you would not argue with my reasons. I appreciated that. I have thought carefully about what I said and what I want to say now, and they are not entirely the same thing. You may come to Hartwell in the new year. I do not know what will come of that visit, and I do not think it would be honest to pretend that I do. But you asked for the permission, and I find, on honest reflection, that I am giving it. I am asking you to come as yourself, the full truth of you, and I will receive you as myself. Whatever follows from that is something we will have to see." She had signed it Margaret Hartwell. He read it twice. Then he set it flat on the desk and looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where he kept things he needed to keep close. He picked up his pen. He wrote back the same day. The letter said only, "I will come on the 15th of January, if that is agreeable. I will come as James Ashford, which is the truest version of what I am. I am grateful for your honesty, and I will try to deserve it." He sealed it and had it sent. That evening, he sat in the library of his northern house, which was a large and well-furnished room that had everything a library should have, and none of the warmth of the smaller room at Hartwell. He sat in a chair that was a better chair than the chair he had sat in there, and he looked at a fire that was a larger fire than that fire, and he thought about a woman sitting in a less fine chair beside a less large fire, reading a book or looking at the flames, in a house that felt more lived in than any house he had sat in for years. His family had been pressing him, through various channels, to make a decision about Lady Cecilia Fairfax. She was 22, well-connected, pleasant in manner, and entirely suitable. His aunt had been particularly direct about it. The Fairfax family had expectations. Society had expectations. There was an appropriate time for these arrangements to be made, and that time was not improved by delay. He had listened to all of this. He thought about Lady Cecilia Fairfax, who was pleasant and suitable. He thought about Margaret Hartwell, who was neither young, nor fashionably connected, nor particularly convenient, and who was also the most honest person he had spoken to in years. He picked up the old estate book. He had been reading it in the evenings. He had almost reached the end. There was a passage near the back that he had not yet seen, and he found it that evening and read it carefully. It said, in the careful language of an earlier century, that the measure of an estate was not its size or its wealth, but the quality of the life that was made within it. That the greatest houses in England were not the largest ones, but the ones in which people understood what they had and cared for it accordingly. In the margin beside this passage, in Edmund Hartwell's careful pencil, were 3 words. "This is right." James looked at those 3 words for a long time. Then he looked at the fire. January was still 2 months away. He had 2 months of work to do: correspondence, accounts, the management of several properties, the conversations with his family that he had been postponing. He had 2 months of his ordinary, obligated, perfectly arranged life. He was prepared to work through all of it. He was not prepared to change the date on the letter he had sent. He turned the page and kept reading. The 15th of January arrived on a clear, cold morning, the kind that felt like the beginning of something, rather than the continuation of winter. Margaret had known it was coming for 2 months. She had kept the date in her mind the way she kept everything that required management, practically, without excess feeling, attending to it only when it required attending to. She had answered his reply with a brief note confirming the date. She had told Mrs. Poole. She had said nothing to Mr. Graves, who managed the farm and did not need to know about house guests. She had told Eleanor, who had written back immediately, with a response that was enthusiastic to the point of embarrassing. She had gone about her ordinary life. She had gone about it very efficiently and with great purpose for 2 months, and she had not thought about the 15th of January more than was reasonable. And if she had, on 1 or 2 occasions, found herself at the kitchen window in the early morning with her tea, thinking about a particular conversation by a fire, she had redirected herself immediately and always found something useful to do. The morning of the 15th, she rose before dawn. She dressed in her best everyday dress, which was a deep gray with a good collar, and she pinned her hair with more attention than usual. She looked at herself in the mirror and thought, "You are a sensible woman of 33 who runs an estate." She went downstairs and put the kettle on. She was standing at the window when she heard the carriage. It came up the lane at 10:30, moving at a moderate speed through the hard, bright morning. Not the grand pace of someone arriving to impress, just the steady movement of someone who knew where they were going and was going there. She watched it come. She watched it stop at the gate. She watched him step down. He was dressed for the country rather than for London. A dark coat, Good boots, no particular ceremony. He looked up at the house immediately. She was at the window, and she did not move away. He saw her. He did not wave. But something in his expression shifted, and even from the distance of the upstairs window, she could see it. She went down to the front door and opened it herself. He was halfway up the lane when the door opened. He stopped for a moment. Then he walked the rest of the distance and came to stand at the foot of the front step, and they looked at each other in the cold January light. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "You found it." "I remembered the gate," he said. She stepped back. "Come in." He came inside. The house received him the way it had received him in October, quietly, without fuss, with the smell of wood smoke and bread from the kitchen. Mrs. Poole appeared and took his coat and greeted him with her usual composed efficiency, and he thanked her in the same tone he had used in October, and Margaret thought, some things do not change. She took him to the sitting room. The fire was already burning. Tea was brought without being asked for. They sat in the two chairs, the same chairs, and the winter light came in at the window, and the house settled around them. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she said. And then, because she had decided, over 2 months of careful thought, that she was going to be absolutely honest about everything, and that starting with pleasantries was not the way to do that. "I have been thinking about this visit for 2 months. He looked at her. "So have I. I want to say something before we go further," she said, "while I still have the clear version of it in my head." "Please," he said. "I received you in October, because it was raining," she said. "What happened over those 3 days was what it was, and I have thought about it, and I do not regret any of it. But I also need to say clearly that I am not a person who does well with things that are not clear. I don't manage well with uncertainty that is left to grow in drawers." He almost smiled at that. He controlled it. "I understand." "I don't know what you're looking for," she said. "I don't know what is possible, given the distance between our situations. I don't know whether any of this is sensible. But I do know that when you asked to come, I wanted you to come, and I think that is probably the most important piece of information I can give you." He looked at her for a long moment. "It is," he said, "the most important piece of information you could have given me." She looked at the fire. "Good," she said. "Now tell me what you're thinking." And he did. He told her about the 2 months he had spent in the North, going through the obligations of his life. He told her about the conversations with his family, about Lady Cecilia Fairfax, and what he had said in response. He told her that what he had said was that he had met someone he wanted to know better, and that knowing better required more time and more honesty than an arranged understanding allowed for, and that he was not prepared to close a door before he had looked through it. He told her that his aunt had been displeased, and that his secretary had been quietly confused, and that the Fairfax family had been notified in a way that was as considerate as such things could be. He told her, looking at her directly and without hedging, that he had thought about those 3 days very clearly, and had concluded that they were the most honest days he had spent in a long time, and that the particular quality of honesty that they had was worth coming back for, and that if she felt the same way, he wanted to understand whether something could be built from it. "And if I don't feel the same way?" she asked. "Then I will go home," he said. "And I will keep the book, which you gave me, and remember the estate, and the fence posts, and the soup." She looked at him. The winter light was steady and clear between them. "I feel the same way," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Relief, or the particular feeling that came after bracing against something for a long time, and finding it unnecessary. "Then," he said, "may I visit again?" "Yes," she said. "Regularly?" he said. "We'll see," she said. He nodded. He accepted that. He was, she thought, a man who understood that some things moved at the pace they moved, and that trying to rush them was both pointless and revealing. Mrs. Poole appeared in the doorway. "Luncheon is ready when you are, ma'am." Margaret stood. "Come and eat," she said to him. He stood. He looked around the room briefly, the way a person looked at something they were glad to see again. "Yes," he said. "All right." They walked to the dining room through the quiet house, and the winter light fell through the east window onto the table, and the food was simple and good, and they sat across from each other, and began, in the honest and unhurried way that both of them preferred, the careful and uncertain, and altogether promising work of learning each other properly. The new year that brought James Ashford back to Hartwell House in January also brought, along with him, the slow attention of a world that noticed things it was not supposed to notice. It began quietly. The Duke of Ashworth was seen twice on the road between London and the Buckinghamshire countryside, once by a farmer who had no particular reason to care, but mentioned it at the market, once by the wife of a minor member of Parliament, who was visiting a neighbour 3 miles from Hartwell, and recognized the crest on the passing carriage, with the immediate, cataloguing attention of a woman who tracked social information the way farmers tracked weather. By February, the first visits had settled into a pattern. Once a fortnight, sometimes once a week when the roads permitted, Margaret received him. They walked the estate. They sat by the fire. They talked with the same candor that had characterized October, except that now it had time and shape to it, the developing understanding of two people who were choosing, deliberately, to know each other. By March, Hartwell's neighbors were whispering. The first person to say anything directly to Margaret was her nearest neighbor, a woman named Dorothy Crane, who arrived for what was presented as a social call and spent 20 minutes asking questions that were not quite about the Duke of Ashworth, while being entirely about the Duke of Ashworth. "I heard," Dorothy said, over her second cup of tea, "that the Ashworth carriage was seen on the Hartwell lane last Tuesday." "It was," Margaret said. Dorothy waited for more. Margaret offered none. "He is a very eligible man," Dorothy said finally. "So I am told," said Margaret. "And you are?" Dorothy paused carefully. "Receiving him." "I am," Margaret said, and looked at Dorothy with the calm, patient expression that she had developed over many years of being a person who did not explain herself unless she chose to. Dorothy left without having learned anything more, which was precisely what Margaret intended. But the visits continued, and the world, being the world, drew its conclusions at the pace it drew them. By April, the conclusions had reached London, where they were discussed in drawing rooms and at dinner tables with the avid attention that society always paid to anything that threatened to become interesting. The Duke of Ashworth, who was 35 and a title and one of the wealthiest men in England, was apparently spending a significant amount of his leisure time visiting a widow of moderate means in Buckinghamshire. There was no formal announcement. There was no public courtship in the usual understanding of the term. There was simply this: a man visiting a house, regularly, over months, in a way that had a quality of purpose to it. Society watched. Society wondered. Society sent, in the form of his aunt, an investigator. Lady Harriet Ashford arrived at James's London house in late April, with the direct and comfortable authority of a woman who had spent 60 years being certain about things, and had found it generally worked. She sat in his drawing room, with very good posture, and a cup of tea she had not touched, and looked at her nephew across the table. "The Hartwell widow," she said. "Her name is Margaret Hartwell," he said. "I am aware of her name," Lady Harriet said. "I have made inquiries. She is the daughter of a Shropshire clergyman, who married a country gentleman of modest land. She was widowed 2 years ago. She manages the estate herself. She has no title, no fortune, and no connections of any significance." A pause. "She is also, by all accounts, a woman of considerable good sense and unusual capability, which is the part that worries me." James looked at her. "Capability worries you?" "Capable women," his aunt said, "tend to be difficult to argue out of things. And I suspect you are in need of being argued out of something." "I am not," he said, pleasantly, without heat. Lady Harriet looked at him with the assessing gaze of a woman who had known him since he was 8 years old. "You are serious about her?" "I am," he said. "The Fairfax family has been informed," he said, "properly, by me, in person, in the way it should be done. Lady Cecilia is a fine young woman, and will make a fine match with someone who is in a position to be what she deserves. I am not that person." His aunt was quiet for a moment. She had the good sense to know when an argument had already concluded, and the dignity to adjust her position when presented with a decision that was settled. "Have you spoken to Mrs. Hartwell about what this involves?" she asked. "We speak about it regularly," he said. "She is not a woman who avoids difficult topics." "She will find it more difficult than she imagines," Lady Harriet said. "The attention, the opinion, the constant management of what people think." She paused. "She lives quietly in Buckinghamshire. That will change." I know, he said. Does she? We have discussed it, he said. At length, she is not. He paused, looking for the right word. She is not naive about the world. She is practical about it. She will make her own assessment. His aunt set down her untouched tea. She looked at him carefully. You are not asking my opinion, she said. I am not, he said. A long pause. She will need to be called on properly, Lady Harriet said at last, in the tone of someone who has decided to redirect, rather than continue an argument they have already lost. I will need to meet her. If the family is to adjust, there must be a meeting. I expected that, he said. It would be better sooner than later, his aunt said. I'll arrange it, he said. Lady Harriet rose. He stood. She looked at him one more time, with the long, searching look of someone who has known a person through their whole life, and is trying to reconcile the person in front of them with every previous version. Are you happy? She asked. It was not what he expected her to ask. He was quiet for a moment. I think I might be, he said. She nodded once. There was something in it. Not approval exactly, but something. An acknowledgement. A small, careful opening of a door that had been very firmly shut. Good, she said, and left. He stood in his drawing room, alone for a while. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to Margaret. The letter told her about his aunt's visit. It told her what had been said. It told her what he had said in response. It told her that his aunt wished to meet her, and that he was not asking her to do anything she did not want to do, but that he wanted her to know the shape of the situation. At the bottom, he added, I want to be clear about one thing. Everything that happens next, every step of whatever this becomes, is your decision as much as mine. I will not move faster than you are comfortable moving. I will not expose you to anything you have not agreed to. And if at any point you decide that this is more than you want to manage, I will accept that without argument. I am asking for nothing except the chance to keep being honest with you. Margaret received the letter on a Tuesday morning and read it at her kitchen table with her tea, the same way she read everything. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in the drawer. Then she went out to the garden and stood in the April light for a while, looking at the apple trees. They had their first buds, small, tight, pale green against the brown of the branches, weeks away from flowers, months from fruit. She looked at them for a long time. Then, she went inside and picked up her pen. She wrote, Bring your aunt. I am not frightened of a meeting. I would rather know the difficulty than imagine it. Come on the 14th. She sealed it and sent it. She went back to work. And the apple trees stood in the April light with their small tight buds, patient as they had always been, growing slowly toward a summer that was coming, whether anyone prepared for it or not. The 14th of May was a perfect day. Not the showy, dramatic perfection of summer, but the quieter, cleaner perfection of late spring. The air still cool in the mornings and warm by midday, the sky a clear and honest blue, the garden at Hartwell running into bloom with the unself-conscious abundance that gardens had when they had been tended well and loved for a long time. Margaret did not rearrange anything for the visit. She told herself this firmly on the morning of the 14th, when the first instinct was to move furniture and instruct the kitchen toward grander things, and otherwise dress the house up as something it was not. She set the instinct aside. This was her house. It had been her house for 11 years, and she had managed it with everything she had, and she was not going to apologize for it, or ornament it for the benefit of a woman who was coming to assess it. She did, however, put flowers in the front room, because it was May, and the garden was full of them, and flowers in a room were not pretension. They were simply paying attention to what was around you. The carriage arrived at 11. Margaret was in the garden when she heard it, cutting the last of the late tulips for the arrangement she had already put in the hall. She set down the basket and went through the garden gate and around the side of the house to the front, and she was standing at the door when the carriage stopped. James stepped out first. He was in his best coat, still plain, still without ceremony, but clearly his best. He looked at her immediately, and something in his expression said, "Are you all right?" She answered it with a small, steady nod. Then Lady Harriet Ashford stepped out. She was tall and upright, and dressed in excellent dark blue, with a good traveling hat that had been on many journeys and still looked distinguished. She was 60 at least, perhaps more, with the face of a woman who had formed opinions early and kept them. She looked at Hartwell House with the considering look of someone assessing it not for grandeur, but for something else. Character, perhaps, or honesty. Then she looked at Margaret. Margaret met her eyes directly. "Lady Harriet," she said. "Welcome to Hartwell." Lady Harriet looked at her for a moment with a gaze that was sharp and measured and gave nothing away. Then she said, "Mrs. Hartwell, thank you for receiving me." It was neither warm nor cold. It was the opening move of a fair game. They went inside. Mrs. Poole had set lunch in the dining room, the east-facing room, the room that got the light. The food was what it always was. Good, simple, properly made. Not a performance. Not an apology. Lady Harriet sat across from Margaret. James sat at the end of the table between them, with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that the important conversation was not going to involve him. They talked about the estate first. Lady Harriet asked sensible questions about the acreage, the tenants, the management structure. She listened to Margaret's answers with visible attention and did not fill the pauses with polite observations the way less secure people did. She simply listened and nodded and asked the next question. Then she said, "My nephew tells me you manage the accounts yourself." "I do," said Margaret. "And before your husband's death? We managed them together. And you prefer the independence." Margaret considered this, as she had when James had asked something similar, months ago, in another conversation, that felt both very far away and very close. "I prefer knowing where I stand," she said. Lady Harriet looked at her. Something shifted very slightly in her expression. Not softening exactly, but an adjustment. The small rebalancing that happened when a preformed opinion encountered something it had not quite anticipated. "My late husband," Lady Harriet said, "managed his accounts himself, and would not hear a word of assistance from anyone. It drove the family absolutely mad." She paused. "He was always right, which made it worse." Margaret looked at her. "I understand that completely," she said. And for the first time, Lady Harriet smiled. It was brief and small and contained, but it was real. After lunch, they walked in the garden. James walked a little behind them, which was the right thing to do, and said very little. Margaret showed Lady Harriet the beds, and the orchard, and the kitchen garden, and Lady Harriet asked questions about the apple varieties, and made observations about the management of espaliered pears that revealed a genuine knowledge of gardens, and a real interest in what she was seeing. At the far end of the orchard, by the oldest trees, Lady Harriet stopped and looked at the gnarled, thick-trunked apple tree that was probably 60 years old and probably would stand for 60 more. "This one was here when you came?" she said. "When my husband's grandfather came," Margaret said. "The young trees on the south end are what my husband planted." Lady Harriet looked at the young trees, which were not young anymore. They were 15 years old and well established, beginning to bear properly. She was quiet for a moment. "He planted long," she said. "Yes," said Margaret. Lady Harriet turned and looked at her, with the assessing look that had been present since arrival, and this time there was something different behind it, something that had been reached. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said, "I came here to understand what my nephew is thinking." "I believe most people who visit would say the same," Margaret said. "And what do you think he's thinking?" Lady Harriet asked. Margaret looked at her. Then she looked at James, who was standing near one of the young apple trees, with his hands behind his back, looking at the blossom on the branches. He was not close enough to hear. He was not trying to be. "I think," Margaret said, "that he is thinking about the same things I am thinking about, which is to say, whether two people who are honest with each other and who like each other, and who understand that what they are attempting is not simple, whether those two people might be able to build something worth building." Lady Harriet was quiet for a moment. "And do you think they can?" she said. Margaret looked at the apple trees, the young ones and the old one, the roots going down and the branches going up, and the blossom on both. "I think it depends," she said, "on whether they are both willing to be patient." Lady Harriet looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at her nephew. Then she turned back. "James," she called across the orchard. "Come here." He looked up. He walked toward them through the grass, unhurried, with the particular stillness that he carried everywhere, and that Margaret had come to understand was not distance, but care. the care of someone who moved thoughtfully, because everything he did mattered to him. He came and stood with them under the old tree. Lady Harriet looked at him, then at Margaret, then at him again. She straightened her hat, which did not need straightening. "Well," she said, "the house is very pleasant, and the garden is very well kept, and Mrs. Hartwell is not what I expected." She paused. "I expected someone more uncertain." "She is not uncertain," James said. "No," Lady Harriet agreed. "She is not." She looked at Margaret one more time. "I imagine the family will adjust," she said. "Eventually, most things do." Then she turned and began walking back toward the house, and she moved with the upright assurance of a woman who had done what she came to do and was satisfied with the result. James looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at him. "Was that good?" he said quietly. "That was very good," she said. The blossom moved in the light breeze above them. The orchard was quiet. Somewhere in the direction of the house, they could hear Mrs. Poole greeting Lady Harriet at the garden door, with the composed efficiency of a woman who had been prepared for exactly this moment, and had managed it, as she managed everything, with absolute competence. James was looking at her with the expression that she knew best now, the full, honest, unguarded one. She looked back at him with the same. "She is going to require time," she said. "Yes," he said, "but she came." "She did," Margaret said. It was enough. It was more than enough, and they both knew it. They stood in the orchard of Hartwell House, on a May afternoon, with the blossom above them, and the old roots below them, and the long, uncertain, full of possibility future somewhere ahead, and they let the moment be exactly what it was. Then Margaret turned and walked toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, and the afternoon was warm and clear, and they went inside. There is a question that people ask at the beginning of love, and almost never ask near the end of it, because by the end, they have already found out the answer. The question is this: can two people be different enough to surprise each other, and similar enough to understand each other, and do both of those things at the same time, for long enough to matter? Margaret Hartwell had not thought of it in those terms. She was not a woman given to thinking in terms of love, not because she was cold, but because she was accurate. Love was a word she used when she was certain of what it described, and certainty, with James Ashford, had been arriving slowly and in layers, the way truth arrived in a well-kept account. Not all at once, but piece by piece, each piece making the picture clearer than the one before. By June she was certain. Not certain of outcomes or futures, or all the complicated things that came with outcomes and futures. Certain of him, specifically. Of the person who arrived at her gate on a damaged road, and ate her soup, and fixed her fence, and borrowed her husband's book, and never once made her feel that being herself was something she needed to apologize for. She was certain of that, and it was enough to work from. The conversation they finally had was in the garden at Hartwell, on a warm June evening, after a dinner that had stretched long in the way that dinners stretched when neither person was in any particular hurry to end them. Mrs. Poole had retired. Owen was in the stables. The house was still and warm, and the garden beyond the window was blue with late dusk light. They were sitting on the bench at the edge of the kitchen garden that caught the last of the evening sun. Margaret had her hands folded in her lap. James was beside her, looking at the apple trees at the end of the orchard. They were in full leaf now, the young ones and the old one both, and the garden had the full green weight of midsummer, deep and settled and permanent. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. "You know?" he said. "I have known for a while that you were going to ask," she said. She smiled, just slightly, still looking at the trees. "I have been thinking about what to say." "And?" he said. She turned then and looked at him. The evening light was still on his face, and he was watching her with the complete and focused attention that she had come to know and trust, the attention of a man who wanted to hear exactly what she said, and not what he hoped she might say. "Yes," she said, "with conditions." He looked at her. "What conditions?" "This house," she said. "Hartwell. It is not my house to sell or give up. It was my husband's house and his father's house and his grandfather's house before that, and my husband planted trees in this garden for the next generation, and I have kept this estate for 2 years through effort and care, and I am not going to fold it into a larger property and let it become an afterthought." "I would never ask you to," he said immediately. "Good," she said, because I would not do it. Hartwell is Hartwell, he said. It stays as it is, managed as it has been managed. Yes, she said. A pause. And the other conditions? He said. Mrs. Poole comes with me, wherever we are, she said. She is part of this house, and I will not leave her behind. Obviously, he said, and I will manage my own accounts. I would expect nothing else, he said. She looked at him. You are agreeing very quickly. Because none of these things are difficult, he said. He looked at her steadily. They are obvious. This is who you are. I am not asking for a different version of you. I am asking for you. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the apple trees. She thought about her husband planting them. She thought about the morning after James's carriage broke, when she had stood at the window with her tea, and the lane had been full of rain, and nothing had been clear. She thought about how much could change in a year, if you let it. All right, she said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any of the ceremony that such a moment might have warranted in other circumstances. Just took her hand, the way two people took each other's hands when they had decided something together and wanted the other person to know that the decision was real. She let him. They sat in the garden as the light faded, and the first stars appeared above the orchard, and neither of them said very much, and neither of them needed to. The decision had been made. It had been made, if they were both honest about it, on the night of a storm in October, 8 months ago, and everything since then had simply been the careful, honest work of verifying it. Mrs. Poole, who was not asleep and had excellent hearing, allowed herself a single, small, satisfied expression in the privacy of the kitchen. Then she went to bed. The engagement was announced in July. It was brief, appearing in the appropriate publication in the appropriate form, and it said, "The marriage is announced between James Edward Ashford, Duke of Ashworth, and Mrs. Margaret Hartwell of Hartwell House, Buckinghamshire." London talked. Of course it talked. Society had been storing up opinions for 8 months, and this was its opportunity to release them all at once, which it did, with the full and enthusiastic commitment that society brought to anything involving a duke, a widow, and a story that did not quite follow the expected lines. Margaret read the announcement in the newspaper on a Tuesday morning and set it down and thought, good. Then she went to see about the drainage in the East Field, which had been concerning her since April, and which Mr. Graves had not adequately addressed. James received a substantial amount of correspondence that week. He answered what required answering, and set aside the rest with the efficient calm of a man who had made his decision and was not interested in relitigating it. Lady Harriet wrote a brief and dignified note acknowledging the announcement. At the bottom, in her own hand, "She is better than I expected, which is the highest compliment I can pay anyone. The family will adapt." The wedding was in September. They were married in the village church where Edmund Hartwell was buried, which had been Margaret's only firm condition on the matter of the wedding. James had agreed without a moment's hesitation. His aunt had made a small sound, and adjusted her hat, and said nothing further. The church was small and old, and the September light came through the clear windows in long, warm slants. There were no great numbers of guests. There was family, and Mrs. Poole, who sat in the second row with perfect composure and eyes that were very slightly bright. There was Eleanor, who cried openly and without apology. There was Mr. Graves, who stood at the back looking gruffly moved. And there was a man and a woman standing at the front of that small church, both of them knowing exactly what they were doing and exactly who they were doing it with, and both of them aware that what they were beginning had already, in the most important ways, begun. The minister said the words. They answered them. The light moved through the windows, and the church was warm and quiet, and outside, the September countryside was golden and still. Margaret did not cry. She had thought she might. She was not, as a general rule, a person who cried easily, but weddings had a way of reaching things you had put away carefully, and she had put away a great deal. She stood beside James and said the words she was asked to say, and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that what she was feeling was not grief, and not loss, and not even happiness, in the simple way that people sometimes use the word. It was more like completion, the feeling of something that had been open for a long time, quietly, and finally closing. Not ending, closing, which was a different thing entirely. Afterward, they walked out of the church into the September afternoon, and the small group of people who had gathered outside to see them made the small, warm sounds of people who were pleased, and the day was golden, and the air was clear, and the elm trees along the church lane held their late leaves in that particular way that elm trees did in the last days of summer, as though they were not quite ready to let them go. James looked at her in the light. She looked at him. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She took his arm. They walked. The years settled as years always did, not dramatically but in layers, each one different from the last, and each one adding something to the whole. They divided their time between Ashworth Hall and Hartwell House, which was exactly what Margaret had insisted on, and it was one of the better decisions of the marriage, which contained many good decisions, because both houses needed someone who cared about them, and both houses had found that. Hartwell was managed as it had always been managed, with Margaret's steady and familiar hand on everything that mattered, and Mr. Graves kept the farm, and the apple trees grew, and the east field drainage was finally sorted in the second year, in exactly the way Margaret had wanted it sorted. Ashworth Hall was larger and grander, and had the weight of several generations of Ashford family history sitting in every room, and Margaret received that weight with the same practical respect she brought to everything. She did not pretend she had been born to it, and she did not apologize for not having been born to it, and she found that most things adjusted themselves once they understood they were not going to be made to feel complicated. Lady Harriet adjusted. It took until the end of the second year, but it happened. The moment that settled it, as far as Margaret could tell, was a conversation they had in the garden at Ashworth Hall, in which Lady Harriet asked about the management of the kitchen garden, and Margaret explained what she had done with the beds at Hartwell, and Lady Harriet said, with the directness that was her particular and considerable quality, "I have been doing it wrong for 20 years. Show me." And Margaret had shown her. And after that they were, if not friends exactly, something that worked very well. The neighborhood in Buckinghamshire adjusted quickly, and with the particular warmth that country neighborhoods had, when something local turned out better than expected. Dorothy Crane admitted freely, over tea at Hartwell 2 years later, that she had been entirely wrong, and that Mrs. Hartwell, now the Duchess, though Margaret never insisted on it, was the best thing to happen to the neighborhood in a decade, and she stood by that. Eleanor visited every year and was never once composed about any of it, which was a quality Margaret had decided to accept as permanent, and even, in a certain light, endearing. Mrs. Poole ran whichever house she was in, with the same efficient, watchful, thoroughly capable hand she had always used, and she grew no more talkative as the years passed, but was observed on several occasions to be satisfied, which for Mrs. Poole was the equivalent of anyone else singing. Owen eventually took charge of the stables at Hartwell, which he managed with the same quiet competence he had shown as a young man holding a frightened horse in a storm on a bad road. And the apple trees in the orchard grew, the way they had been growing long before any of them arrived, and would grow long after. The young trees that Edmund Hartwell had planted were tall and properly established now, bearing well every year, the kind of trees that had become the kind of trees that would stand for the next generation to inherit. James read the old estate book again, every winter. He had read it so many times by the fourth year that the pages were soft at the edges. He never returned it, and Margaret never asked for it. It had been given, and it stayed given. When people asked Margaret, and they did ask, because people always asked, how she had come to marry the Duke of Ashworth, she told them the truth, which was, his carriage broke, it was raining, and she did not see the point in leaving him in the ditch. She never mentioned the title. The title was the least interesting part of the story. What she sometimes thought about, in the early mornings when she was alone with her tea and the kitchen window, and the garden coming into light, was the moment in October, 2 years before she married him, when she had gone to bed on the night of the storm, and listened to the rain on the roof. She had thought, that night, that the house felt different, warmer and fuller, not because of the fire. She had told herself it was just the rain. She smiled, now, at that. At the person she had been who had said, "It is just the rain," who had been brisk and sensible and practical about everything, including things that were not, in the end, the kind of things that brisk practicality was equipped to manage. She sipped her tea. The garden came into light. The apple trees stood in their steady rows, the old one and the young ones, roots deep in the English ground, patient and growing. The house was awake around her. She could hear the sounds of it, the familiar footsteps, The voices of the household beginning the day, the warmth spreading outward from the kitchen toward the rest of the rooms. She set her cup down. She had work to do, as she always had. Accounts to attend to, and a letter to write, and a question to put to Mr. Graves about the north field. But for a moment, she stood at the window and looked at the garden and the light and the old tree at the end of the orchard that had been standing before any of them were born, and would be standing after, its roots going down to where the deep and quiet earth held everything it had been given, and gave it back, season after season, without being asked. She thought about kindness, about how it was, almost always, the simplest thing, the open door, the dry room, the bowl of soup set in front of someone who needed it, how it asked nothing in return, and expected nothing, and was given because it was the right thing, and not for any other reason. And how sometimes, very rarely, what it gave back was more than you could have imagined when you stepped out into the rain. She turned from the window. She went to her desk and picked up her pen, and began the letter to her sister, who was coming next month, and who would want to know everything, because she always did, and always had, and Margaret had long since stopped minding. Outside, the morning light moved across the garden. The apple trees stood in it, the old one and the young ones, patient and still, their roots in the good ground. Everything, in its time.